Welcome to this channel, where the past comes alive with tales that shape our present and future. Today, we embark on a journey through one of the most fascinating and tumultuous stories in European history: the rise, fall, and rebirth of Poland. From its grand days as a European power to the tragic partitions that erased it from the map, to the undying spirit of its people in their struggle for independence. Poland's story is one of resilience, revolution, and transformation. By the end of this history, you will not only understand Poland's past, but also the values that fueled its fight for freedom. So, if you're ready to dive deep into Poland's epic tale, keep listening. You're in for a ride through centuries of triumph, sorrow, and the relentless pursuit of a nation's soul. In the late Middle Ages, Poland was united with Lithuania in a unique political and military alliance known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This alliance was formalized in the Union of Lublin in 1569, creating one of the largest and most powerful countries in Europe at the time. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a multi-ethnic state that included not only Poles and Lithuanians, but also Belarusians, Ukrainians, Jews, and other ethnic minorities. The Commonwealth's political structure was based on a system of elective monarchy, where the king was chosen by a vote of the nobility. This system, although democratic in theory, led to political instability as the nobility, or szlachta, often sought to advance their own interests over the nations. During the 16th and early 17th centuries, the Commonwealth flourished as a center of culture and learning. The Polish Renaissance saw significant advancements in art, science, and literature. The country became an important player in European politics, engaging in conflicts with the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and Sweden. Poland's military successes, particularly during the reign of King Stefan Batory, 1576 to 1586, cemented its position as a formidable power in Central Europe. However, the vast size and diversity of the Commonwealth also brought challenges in governance, leading to internal divisions and increasing weakness. By the late 17th century, the once mighty Commonwealth began to experience significant decline. The Golden Liberty, the system that granted extensive powers to the nobility, including the right to veto legislation, led to political paralysis and instability. This constant infighting and a lack of a strong central authority made it difficult for the Commonwealth to respond to external threats. In the early 18th century, neighboring powers began to exploit Poland's vulnerability. One of the key turning points in Poland's decline was the reign of Augustus II the Strong, 1697 to 1706, 1709 to 1733. A Saxon elector who sought to increase his influence over Poland. Augustus's reign marked the beginning of a period known as the Deluge in Polish history, a time when foreign powers, particularly Russia and Sweden, intervened heavily in Polish politics. The Swedish invasion of 1700 to 1706 and the subsequent Russian intervention devastated Poland's infrastructure and economy. The internal struggles between the various factions of the nobility further weakened the country, leaving it susceptible to the influence of its neighbors. By the mid-18th century, the Polish monarchy had become a mere puppet of foreign powers. Poland was no longer a major player on the European stage, and its once proud independence was rapidly diminishing. The country's fate now seemed to be sealed as its neighbors prepared to take advantage of its internal weaknesses. The first partition of Poland in 1772 marked the beginning of the end for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The partition was the result of a series of diplomatic maneuvers by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, who sought to expand their own territories at Poland's expense. The Russian Empire, under Empress Catherine the Great, had already been exerting significant influence over Poland's internal affairs, particularly through the Confederation of Bar and other political factions. Prussia, led by Frederick the Great, was eager to gain more territory in the region, while Austria sought to stabilize its own borders. The first partition was a relatively bloodless affair compared to the later partitions, but it had devastating consequences for Poland. The three powers divided up roughly a third of Poland's territory among themselves, leaving the country with a weakened and fragmented state. The partition was officially ratified by the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1773. Poland's political system, already on the brink of collapse, was further undermined by this loss of territory, and its ability to defend itself against future attacks was severely compromised. The first partition of Poland in 1772 dealt a devastating blow to the country, and it set the stage for a series of events that would ultimately lead to the nation's erasure from the map. Poland's territorial loss was significant. Approximately a third of its land was ceded to the three partitioning powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The once proud Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had been one of the largest and most diverse empires in Europe, was now a shadow of its former self. Its territories were reduced to a fractured and weakened state. The partition, however, did not end the Polish desire for independence. In the aftermath of this first blow, there was a surge of national consciousness among the Polish people. Despite the fact that Poland was no longer a major power, there were still intellectuals, nobles, and revolutionaries who sought to preserve the idea of a free Polish state. The ruling elites of Poland began to realize that in order to survive, they had to modernize and reform the system of government. King Stanislav II Augustus Poniatowski, who had been placed on the throne by Empress Catherine the Great, was one such reformer. Stanislav Augustus, despite being influenced by Russia, recognized the need for reform to counteract the growing power of the partitioning states. However, his reign was largely ineffective in bringing about meaningful change, and the reforms that were attempted were often too little, too late. The loss of territory, the political fragmentation, and the external pressure from neighboring powers made it clear that Poland's future as an independent nation was uncertain. But a growing group of reformers began to push for changes that would transform Poland from a weak and fragmented state into a modern European power. During the late 18th century, Poland was experiencing a period of intellectual and cultural awakening known as the Polish Enlightenment. Much like other European nations, Poland saw the rise of rationalism, the promotion of scientific ideas, and the development of new political philosophies. Many of the country's intellectuals and reformers were inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, and they began to call for political reforms that would strengthen the central government and provide more rights for the common people. The Polish Enlightenment thinkers sought to establish a political system that would be more in line with the modern ideas of liberty and equality. One of the most significant efforts to reform the Polish state came in the form of the Constitution of May 3, 1791. This was a groundbreaking document in the history of European constitutionalism, as it sought to introduce a more democratic form of government, limit the power of the nobility, and create a stronger executive branch. The Constitution was inspired by the revolutionary ideas circulating in Europe, particularly in France, and it aimed to strengthen Poland's political structure by promoting the rights of citizens and curbing the influence of foreign powers. The May 3rd Constitution was a bold move to reform Poland's government and restore its independence. It was one of the first modern constitutions in Europe, and it granted important rights to the common people. It also introduced significant reforms in the political and military spheres, including changes to the system of local government and the military. The new constitution was an attempt to create a more unified and modern Polish state, but it was met with immediate opposition from both the nobility, who feared the loss of their privileges, and the partitioning powers, who saw it as a challenge to their dominance over Poland. The Second Partition of Poland in 1793 was a direct response to the reforms of the May 3rd Constitution and the growing sense of Polish nationalism. Russia, Prussia and Austria were determined to prevent Poland from regaining its independence, and they saw the new constitution as a threat to their control over the country. The second partition was carried out with much greater force than the first, and it involved significant military action. Russia, led by Empress Catherine the Great, and Prussia, under the leadership of King Frederick William II, were particularly determined to crush any efforts to restore Polish sovereignty. In 1793, after a brief period of relative peace, Russia and Prussia moved to divide up Poland once again. The territories ceded to Russia and Prussia in the Second Partition were substantial, and they included much of the remaining territory of the Commonwealth. The partition left Poland with even less land than before, and the country's ability to resist foreign domination became even more limited. The Polish people, however, did not surrender without a fight. The Second Partition sparked the Kosciuszko Uprising in 1794, a desperate attempt by Polish patriots, led by the military hero Tadeusz Kosciuszko, to defend the remaining Polish territories and preserve their independence. Despite the heroic efforts of Kosciuszko and his forces, the uprising was crushed by the combined military might of Russia and Prussia. The defeat of the uprising marked the final blow to Polish independence and set the stage for the third and final partition, which would erase Poland from the map for over a century. The Second Partition, like the first, was a devastating blow to the Polish nation, but it also spurred a new generation of Polish patriots to continue the fight for freedom. Poland's struggle for independence would not end with the partitions, but the road to recovery would be long and difficult. The Kosciuszko Uprising of 1794 represents one of the most heroic chapters in Polish history, symbolizing the nation's undying spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. Tadeusz Kosciuszko, a military leader who had previously fought in the American Revolution alongside George Washington, was chosen to lead the insurrection. He was committed to the restoration of Polish independence and sought to unify the Polish people against the foreign powers that had partitioned their homeland. The uprising was spurred by the brutal consequences of the Second Partition of Poland, which had effectively divided the country into zones controlled by Russia and Prussia. The sense of national pride, combined with the failures of earlier reform efforts, catalyzed a wave of popular resistance. Kosciuszko's strategy was to rally both the nobility and the common people, including peasants, to the cause. His promise of emancipation for the serfs was revolutionary, as it offered an opportunity to gain support from the working class, who were typically excluded from Poland's feudal structure. However, the uprising faced significant challenges from start. The Polish forces were outnumbered and lacked the necessary resources to fight the well-equipped Russian and Prussian armies. Despite these difficulties, Kosciuszko's leadership inspired a number of successful skirmishes, including the victory at the Battle of Raklowice in April 1794. The victory at Raklowice was a moment of great pride for the Polish people, as Kosciuszko's forces, despite being under-equipped and outmanned, managed to inflict serious losses on the Russian army. The Battle of Raklowice became a symbol of Polish resistance, demonstrating that the spirit of the nation could still rise even in the face of immense adversity. However, the success was short-lived. The foreign armies soon regrouped, and in the following months, the rebellion was gradually crushed. Despite their courage and unity, the Polish forces could not withstand the overwhelming military superiority of the Russian and Prussian armies. By the summer of 1794, the Kosciuszko Uprising was facing inevitable defeat. The combined forces of Russia, Prussia, and Austria overwhelmed the Polish insurgents, who had hoped for foreign assistance but received little support. The European powers, particularly Russia, had no interest in seeing a strong, independent Poland rise from the ashes of the partitions. Instead, they sought to eliminate any remaining threats to their dominance in Central Europe. The Russian Empire, under Empress Catherine the Great and later her successor, Sir Paul I, saw Poland as a buffer state in a strategic region that could not afford to be autonomous. Kosciuszko was eventually forced to retreat, and by October 1794, the Polish forces had been decisively defeated. Kosciuszko himself was captured by the Russians and imprisoned for several years. The fall of the uprising marked the end of any serious resistance to foreign rule within Poland, and it laid the groundwork for the final and most devastating blow to the nation's existence, the Third Partition. Although Poland's military resistance was crushed, the Kosciuszko uprising had a lasting impact. It stirred nationalist sentiment and helped keep the dream of independence alive, even during the many years of foreign occupation. The events of the uprising also highlighted the deep divisions between Poland's political elites and the common people, and Kosciuszko's efforts to involve the lower classes in the fight for independence would inspire future generations of Polish revolutionaries. The failure of the uprising did not mean the end of Poland's struggle. Rather, it marked a temporary setback in a much longer battle for sovereignty that would continue to be fought through the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the wake of the failure of the Kosciuszko uprising, the remaining forces of Polish resistance were crushed, and Poland was left defenseless against the predatory ambitions of its neighboring powers. The Third Partition of Poland, finalized in 1795, was the culmination of a series of devastating political and military events that erased Poland from the map of Europe. The partitioning powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, had long sought to divide Poland into territories that would serve their own strategic interests, and the final partition was their decisive move to eliminate the once great nation from the European landscape. The Third Partition resulted in the complete dissolution of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland's remaining territories were divided among the three powers in a process that was both legally sanctioned and brutally enforced. Russia took control of the vast majority of the eastern territories, including much of present-day Belarus and Ukraine. Prussia gained a substantial portion of the western lands, including parts of modern-day Poland and Lithuania, while Austria annexed the southern territories, including Galicia. The Polish people, who had once enjoyed a significant degree of autonomy and power, now found themselves living under foreign occupation with little hope of reclaiming their independence in the foreseeable future. The Third Partition was a tragic moment in Polish history. It meant the end of centuries of Polish sovereignty and marked the beginning of a 123-year period in which Poland would cease to exist as an independent state. The lands of the Commonwealth were now part of foreign empires, and the people of Poland were subject to the laws and control of their occupiers. However, the idea of Polish independence did not die with the partition. Throughout the 19th century, Polish nationalists, intellectuals, and revolutionaries would continue to fight for their homeland, organizing uprisings and seeking support from the broader European community. The memory of Poland's former glory would live on in the hearts of its people, who never gave up hope of restoring their nation's independence. The partitions of Poland in 1772, 1793, and 1795 had far-reaching consequences on Polish society, politics, and culture. Once one of Europe's most powerful and influential nations, Poland was now a divided land under the control of foreign empires, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The Polish people were left with a fractured identity, and many struggled to preserve their heritage and culture while living under foreign domination. The partitions not only ended Poland's political independence, but also brought about profound changes in the social and economic structure of the nation. Under the foreign powers, Poland's once independent nobility found themselves losing their privileges, while the peasantry faced continued exploitation. In Prussia and Austria, the political systems were repressive, and in Russia, the Polish people experienced a harsh form of autocratic rule. Yet, Despite the oppressive conditions, Polish culture and identity remained resilient. In the face of foreign suppression, the Polish people clung to their language, traditions, and religion. Polish intellectuals, writers, and artists worked to preserve the nation's cultural memory, and the fight for independence remained a central theme in Polish literature and thought. In the early 19th century, the ideas of the French Revolution, particularly the concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity, began to permeate across Europe. These ideas found a fertile ground among the Polish intelligentsia, who saw them as a means to overthrow foreign domination. For many, the idea of national sovereignty was inextricably linked to the ideals of democracy and the rights of man. These ideas inspired several uprisings and movements for Polish independence throughout the 19th century, even though most of these efforts were tragically unsuccessful. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and his wars of conquest across Europe offered a brief window of opportunity for the Polish people to regain their independence. Napoleon's victories in the early 19th century shook the established European powers, and in 1807, he created the Duchy of Warsaw, a French client state that included much of Poland's former territory. While the Duchy of Warsaw was not fully independent, it was a significant step toward the restoration of Polish statehood, and for a time, it raised hopes for the revival of the Polish nation. The Duchy of Warsaw existed from 1807 to 1815 and was essentially a satellite of the French Empire. Napoleon appointed a Polish prince, Józef Poniatowski, as the head of the duchy, and for a brief period, Polish political and military life experienced a degree of autonomy. The Duchy of Warsaw became a symbol of Polish hopes for national rebirth, and many Polish soldiers fought in Napoleon's campaigns, including the famous Polish Lancers. However, the promise of Polish independence was ultimately short-lived. After Napoleon's defeat in 1814, the Congress of Vienna, 1815, reshuffled the map of Europe and dissolved the Duchy of Warsaw. Much of the territory that had once been part of the duchy was returned to Prussia, Austria, and Russia. While the Duchy of Warsaw was gone, its brief existence had an enduring impact on Polish nationalism. Many Poles saw Napoleon as a champion of their cause, and his temporary creation of a Polish state became a rallying point for later efforts to regain independence. The hope for Polish sovereignty, reignited by Napoleon's promise, continued to burn in the hearts of many Poles as they faced the harsh realities of continued foreign rule. Despite the setbacks of the early 19th century, the Polish people did not give up their struggle for independence. One of the most significant uprisings during this period was the November Uprising of 1830 to 1831. This was a rebellion against Russian control, led by Polish army officers and supported by the general population. The rebellion was sparked by dissatisfaction with Russian oppression and the refusal of the Russian Tsar, Nicholas I, to grant Poland any form of autonomy. The uprising initially began as a military revolt, but it quickly escalated into a national movement for independence. The uprising began on November 29, 1830, when Polish officers in Warsaw seized control of key government buildings and declared the independence of Poland. The Polish forces were initially successful, and they managed to gain control of much of the country. The hopes for independence soared, as many believed that Poland could once again be free. However, the Russian Empire, under Tsar Nicholas I, responded with overwhelming military force. The Russian army invaded Poland, and after months of brutal fighting, the uprising was crushed. The defeat of the November Uprising had devastating consequences for Poland. The Russian Empire enacted harsh reprisals, and many of Poland's political leaders and military leaders were executed, exiled, or imprisoned. The Polish nobility, once powerful in the Commonwealth, was further marginalized under Russian rule. The failure of the November Uprising marked the end of any serious attempts to regain independence in the short term. It also deepened the sense of Polish national identity, as the rebellion was viewed as a heroic, though ultimately tragic, effort to restore the sovereignty of the Polish state. The November Uprising of 1830 to 1831 had profound consequences for Polish society and its quest for independence. While it ended in defeat, the uprising left a lasting legacy in the development of Polish nationalism. For many Poles, the uprising became a symbol of their enduring desire for sovereignty and freedom. The Polish people, especially the intellectuals and the elite, began to understand that their struggle for independence could not rely solely on military actions, but had to be part of a broader cultural, political, and social movement. Despite the harsh repression that followed the collapse of the uprising, Polish national identity did not dissipate. In fact, the failure of the rebellion reinforced a deep sense of patriotism and the importance of preserving Polish traditions, language, and culture. The defeat led to an increased emphasis on clandestine activities, such as the creation of secret societies, cultural institutions, and the publication of nationalist literature. These groups would eventually provide the intellectual foundation for future uprisings and revolutions throughout the 19th century. One of the most important outcomes of the November Uprising was the development of a strong sense of Polish solidarity among the working classes, peasants, and intellectuals. The defeat of the uprising also created a renewed sense of urgency among Polish leaders to find international support. They sought to bring the Polish issue to the attention of the broader European community, hoping that the concept of nationalism could find favor in the eyes of the larger European powers. In many ways, the November Uprising served as a precursor to future nationalist movements across Europe, contributing to the rise of Romantic nationalism, particularly in the wake of the revolutions of 1848. The failure of the November Uprising did not mean that Poland's quest for independence was over. In the mid-19th century, a wave of revolutionary fervor swept across Europe, known as the Springtime of Nations or the Revolutions of 1848. This period was marked by widespread uprisings and revolts in many European countries, driven by demands for democratic reforms, national independence, and the rights of citizens. These revolutions were particularly significant in the Austrian Empire, the Kingdom of Hungary, and Italy. For Poland, the revolutions of 1848 represented a moment of hope that European upheaval might lead to a renewed opportunity for national freedom. In Poland, the 1848 uprisings were primarily motivated by the desire for independence from the partitioning powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Although the Polish revolutionaries were inspired by the broader European movements, they were also seeking to address their own national issues. The revolts, especially in the territories of the former Duchy of Warsaw, now part of Prussia, were characterized by a combination of military insurrection and political agitation. Despite the enthusiasm for independence, the revolts were poorly coordinated, and the Polish insurgents lacked the support and military strength necessary to challenge the occupying powers effectively. Although the revolutions of 1848 failed to achieve immediate independence for Poland, they played a crucial role in the evolution of Polish national consciousness. The uprisings sparked new discussions about the relationship between Poland and its neighboring powers. The failures of the 1848 revolts, however, did lead to the establishment of more widespread nationalist movements across the Polish territories. The idea of an independent Polish state continued to be nurtured by intellectuals, exiles, and revolutionary leaders who believed that Poland's moment of liberation was still to come. In the aftermath of the failed uprisings of 1830 to 1831 and 1848, many Polish revolutionaries fled the country to escape repression. These exiles, often referred to as the Polish immigration, played a crucial role in shaping the future of Polish nationalism and the struggle for independence. Many of the prominent leaders of the 1830 and 1848 uprisings, such as Adam Mickiewicz, Juliusz Slowacki, and others, sought refuge in Western Europe, particularly in France. These intellectuals and political figures formed organizations that advocated for the restoration of Polish sovereignty and rallied support from foreign governments. One of the most notable episodes in the Polish immigration's history occurred in the context of the Paris Commune of 1871. This uprising in France, led by working-class Parisians, was a brief but intense struggle for revolutionary socialist ideals. Although the Paris Commune was not directly related to the Polish national movement, many Polish exiles and revolutionaries took part in the Commune, seeing it as an opportunity to advance their own cause of national liberation. The failure of the Commune, which was brutally suppressed by the French government, underscored the difficult and often tragic path that the Polish nationalist movement would take in the late 19th century. The Paris Commune and its aftermath were a significant moment in the history of Polish immigration, as they marked a shift in the way that Polish nationalists viewed their struggle. Exiled Poles began to engage more directly with European revolutionary movements, drawing parallels between their own fight for independence and the broader European quest for justice and self-determination. The Commune also contributed to the development of a more internationalist view among Polish intellectuals, who began to see their struggle as part of a larger movement for the rights of oppressed peoples across Europe. Following the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Poland found itself divided among the great European powers, with a portion of its lands given back to Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The Russian Empire controlled much of the former Polish territories, particularly the Kingdom of Poland, which was established as a semi-autonomous state under Russian rule. However, this autonomy was only nominal, and the Kingdom of Poland quickly fell under the heavy hand of Russian control. Tsar Nicholas I sought to solidify Russian dominance, abolishing many of the reforms introduced during the brief period of Polish independence under the Duchy of Warsaw. The Polish aristocracy, once powerful, lost much of its influence, and the Polish language and culture were increasingly suppressed in favor of Russian language and customs. Despite these challenges, the Polish people did not remain passive. They began to organize and form secret societies aimed at revitalizing Polish identity and preserving their culture. The secret society of the Friends of the Constitution was one such group, founded in the early 19th century, which sought to protect Polish traditions and resist Russian domination. Polish intellectuals, poets, and revolutionaries began to vocalize their discontent, leading to a growing sense of national identity among the Polish people. Yet, Russian repression made any open resistance difficult and dangerous. The 1830s marked a period of heightened unrest, and in 1831, the Polish people finally rose up in what would become known as the November Uprising. Inspired by the failure of the November Uprising of 1830, which was sparked by the Russian Empire's failure to respect Poland's autonomy and the imposition of Russian-controlled military units in the kingdom, the Polish revolt sought to challenge the Russian yoke. However, the Russian forces, led by Tsar Nicholas I, crushed the uprising with brutal efficiency, resulting in significant Polish casualties and further oppressions. The defeat of this rebellion saw the implementation of even more stringent policies, including the deportation of Polish nationalists and the disbanding of Polish military units. In the wake of the November Uprising, the Polish nationalists sought to continue their struggle against Russian control. This came to a head in 1863, when the Polish people launched the January Uprising, a final attempt to restore Polish independence. The uprising was sparked by Russia's increasing authoritarian rule. as well as the tensions between the Polish population and the Russian Empire, which had grown increasingly harsh in its policies towards Polish intellectuals, nobility, and common people alike. The January uprising was initially fueled by a desire for greater political autonomy and the restoration of Polish sovereignty. However, the movement was also deeply connected to broader European and global movements for liberty and justice. The leaders of the uprising, mainly the intelligentsia, rural peasant leaders, and exiled revolutionaries, believed that they could rally the Polish people to rise up against Russian domination. The Russian response was swift and brutal, with Russian forces quickly moving to quash the uprising. What followed was a long and bloody series of battles, and despite some initial successes, the Polish forces were once again defeated by the Russian military. The aftermath of the January uprising was devastating for the Polish people. The Russian Empire implemented severe reprisals, and many of the leaders were executed or exiled. Additionally, thousands of Polish insurgents were either killed in battle or forced into servitude under the Russian regime. The destruction of Polish civil society in the wake of the uprising was a tragic blow to the hopes for national independence, and the Polish people faced even greater repression and discrimination. In the wake of the uprising, the Russian Empire imposed a policy of Russification in Poland, aimed at eradicating the Polish language, culture, and institutions. The nationalist movements that had taken root over the previous decades were temporarily crushed, but Polish hopes for independence would not be extinguished. In the aftermath of the uprisings and revolutions, many of Poland's intellectuals, military leaders, and revolutionaries fled the country, seeking refuge in the cities of Western Europe, particularly Paris and London. This Polish diaspora would play a critical role in keeping the flames of nationalism alive during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The exile communities became hubs for Polish intellectual and political activity, and their members became leading advocates for Polish independence on the international stage. One of the most significant contributions of the exile communities was the preservation and promotion of Polish culture. Polish poets and writers, such as Adam Mickiewicz, Juliusz Slowacki, and Cyprian Kamil Norwood, became central figures in the development of Polish national identity. Through their works, they celebrated the history, myths, and traditions of the Polish people, keeping the spirit of independence alive. They wrote not only about Poland's past, but also about its future, inspiring generations of Polish patriots to continue the fight for national freedom. At the same time, the exile communities worked tirelessly to raise awareness of Poland's plight among European powers. The Polish question, whether Poland should be restored as an independent nation, became a significant issue in European diplomacy. Polish exiles formed political groups and alliances with European revolutionaries and governments sympathetic to their cause. Many of these groups worked to garner support for a Polish uprising, whether through diplomatic means, military action, or revolution. The Polish struggle for independence was no longer confined to the borders of the partition territories, but became a cause that transcended national boundaries. Polish exiles worked alongside other European revolutionaries, particularly during the revolutions of 1848 and in the subsequent years. These exiles would continue to serve as the voice of Poland in exile and keep the dream of independence alive. Their efforts would play a crucial role in the eventual reemergence of an independent Polish state in the 20th century. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 marked a turning point in European politics and the future of Poland. In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, European leaders sought to restore stability and redraw the map of Europe. Poland, having been partitioned in the late 18th century by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, was a crucial issue for the diplomats of the Congress. The question of what to do with Poland became central to the diplomatic negotiations. The Congress of Vienna created the Congress Kingdom of Poland, which was placed under the control of Tsar Alexander I of Russia. While the kingdom was nominally independent, with a constitution and its own army, it was essentially a puppet state under Russian domination. The Congress of Vienna's decision to re-establish Poland as a semi-autonomous entity was seen as a compromise designed to placate Polish nationalists while keeping the territory under Russian control. This arrangement was unsatisfactory for many Poles who believed that their country had been given only the illusion of independence, with real power still resting in the hands of the Russian emperor. Although the Congress Kingdom of Poland had some degree of autonomy, its political structure was heavily influenced by the Russian Empire. Tsar Alexander I had the right to appoint the King of Poland, and the Russian army was stationed in the kingdom, ensuring that any attempts at rebellion would be quickly quashed. The Polish people were deeply dissatisfied with this arrangement, feeling that their national identity and sovereignty had been compromised. As a result, the question of Polish independence continued to simmer throughout the 19th century, leading to repeated uprisings and revolutionary movements against Russian control. The 19th century was marked by widespread social, political, and economic upheaval throughout Europe. In the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, the idea of nationalism gained significant traction as many nations sought to assert their independence and sovereignty. Poland, however, remained trapped under the control of its three partitioning powers: Russia, Prussia, and Austria. These European powers were deeply invested in maintaining the status quo, and any movements for Polish independence were viewed as a threat to their control over the region. The Polish revolts of 1830 and 1848 were directly influenced by the broader European revolutionary movements of the time. The July Revolution in France in 1830, which saw the overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy and the establishment of a more liberal regime, inspired many Polish intellectuals and nationalists to demand similar changes in Poland. The November Uprising of 1830, which took place in the Russian-controlled Congress Kingdom of Poland, was a direct response to the perceived betrayal of Polish autonomy by the Russian Empire. The Polish forces, led by the army and local elites, initially achieved some success in their bid to reclaim independence. However, the Russian Empire, under Tsar Nicholas I, responded with overwhelming military force and crushed the uprising. The failure of the November Uprising was a devastating blow to the Polish cause. Thousands of Polish rebels were killed or exiled to Siberia, and the Russian Empire further tightened its control over the kingdom. Nevertheless, the spirit of rebellion did not die. In 1848, a wave of revolutions spread across Europe, including the Springtime of Nations, which was characterized by demand for national independence, liberal reforms, and social justice. In Poland, this period saw the eruption of another uprising, the Greater Poland Uprising, as well as the organization of smaller insurrections against both Russian and Prussian rule. However, like the November Uprising, the revolutions of 1848 were unsuccessful in achieving lasting independence for Poland. Although many Polish revolutionaries took part in the broader European uprisings, they were unable to coordinate their efforts effectively or gain substantial support from foreign powers. The uprisings were quickly suppressed, and Poland's partitioning powers once again reasserted their control over the territory. Despite these setbacks, the revolutions of 1848 were important because they marked the growing influence of the idea of nationalism in Europe, and they further cemented the notion that Poland's struggle for independence was part of a larger European movement for freedom and self-determination. Following the failures of the 1830 and 1848 uprisings, many of Poland's leading intellectuals, military leaders, and political figures were forced into exile. These exiles played a critical role in keeping the Polish struggle for independence alive. Polish émigrés, particularly in Paris, London, and other European capitals, formed political groups and revolutionary organizations dedicated to the restoration of Poland's sovereignty. These exile communities became central to the development of Polish nationalism, as they provided a platform for discussing Polish independence and advocating for the cause of national liberation. The Polish exile community was instrumental in the creation of a new national identity, which blended romantic nationalism with a desire for liberty and justice. Intellectuals like Adam Mickiewicz and Juliusz Slowacki, who had fled Poland after the failures of the uprisings, became leading figures in the cultural and political life of the Polish diaspora. Through their poetry, literature, and speeches, they inspired a new generation of Poles to continue the fight for independence. Their works glorified Poland's past and its struggles for freedom, portraying the nation's fate as part of the larger European struggle for liberty. Additionally, Polish exiles worked tirelessly to gain the support of European powers for the Polish cause. Many exiled Polish leaders sought to convince the French, British, and other European powers to support a Polish uprising or to provide diplomatic support for the restoration of Poland's independence. They argued that a free and independent Poland would be a bulwark against Russian expansion and would contribute to the broader European project of self-determination. While these efforts were largely unsuccessful in the short term, they laid the foundation for the later diplomatic efforts that would eventually result in the re-establishment of an independent Polish state in the 20th century. As the 19th century progressed, Polish nationalism began to take on new dimensions, driven by both the continued oppression of the partitioning powers and the growing sense of European nationalism. The period between the failed uprisings of 1830 and 1848 and the rise of modern political movements in the late 19th century saw the formation of new national organizations, revolutionary societies, and intellectual movements that aimed to promote Polish independence. Despite the crushing of these uprisings, the dreams of a free Poland were kept alive in the hearts of many Poles, who continued to fight for their national identity in different ways. At the forefront of this resurgence of Polish nationalism were intellectuals and political thinkers who argued that the Polish people's history, culture, and language were a vital part of Europe's cultural heritage. Romanticism, which had swept across Europe in the early 19th century, played a critical role in the formation of Polish nationalism. Polish writers and poets, including Adam Mickiewicz, Juliusz Slowacki, and Cyprian Kamil Norwid, wrote extensively about Poland's past and its idealized future. They invoked themes of sacrifice, patriotism, and the struggle for freedom, using literature to inspire the next generation of Poles to continue the fight for independence. Meanwhile, the formation of nationalist political movements began to take shape in Polish society. Many of these movements were driven by the notion that the future of Poland depended on its ability to modernize and adopt European-style political reforms. The idea of a modern, independent Poland, free from foreign rule, became more widely discussed in the Polish political sphere. There were also a growing number of Polish military officers and revolutionaries who sought to collaborate with European powers, particularly France, to spark another revolution that could restore Polish sovereignty. The concept of a free Poland was increasingly viewed as part of a larger European movement for self-determination. The long period of foreign occupation, particularly the Russian domination of the Congress Kingdom of Poland, continued to shape the political landscape of the region throughout the 19th century. Under Russian rule, Poland was subjected to various forms of repression, including the suppression of Polish culture and language. Russian authorities sought to eliminate any traces of Polish identity in the areas under their control. For instance, the use of the Polish language was restricted in schools, and Polish political organizations were disbanded or outlawed. Despite this oppression, political activism in Poland began to take on new forms. Revolutionary groups, such as the National Democrats and the Socialists were formed to resist Russian control and to push for Polish independence. These political movements advocated for different means of achieving national freedom, from armed rebellion to diplomatic means. Many of these activists were inspired by the success of other European nationalist movements, particularly the unification of Germany in 1871 and the Italian Risorgimento, which demonstrated that the dream of a united and independent nation-state could be achieved through a combination of revolutionary action and diplomatic negotiations. In the late 19th century, these movements gained momentum and Polish political organizations became more coordinated in their approach. The National Democratic Party, led by Roman Dmowski, focused on the idea of Polish nationalism based on the unity of the Polish people, advocating for independence and national self-determination through peaceful means and diplomatic engagement with European powers. On the other hand, socialist movements such as the Polish Socialist Party, led by Józef Pilsudski, sought to address the social issues facing Poland's peasantry and working class while also pushing for national independence. These movements were important because they provided a platform for the Polish people to demand their rights, both within Poland and on the international stage. As the century wore on, the idea of a Polish state began to gain more traction among the European powers. However, it was clear that Polish political independence would not be achieved without significant sacrifice. The people of Poland would have to continue fighting, not just with weapons, but with ideas, diplomacy, and solidarity. During the 19th century, the Polish exile communities in Western Europe and the United States played a pivotal role in advocating for Polish independence. Following the failed uprisings of 1830 and 1848, many of Poland's most influential leaders were forced to flee to exile. These exiles, often political refugees, helped keep the idea of Polish independence alive in the international political arena. They formed political groups, published newspapers and pamphlets, and lobbied European governments for support in the fight for Polish sovereignty. The Polish exile community was particularly active in France, which had long been a hub of revolutionary activity and a source of support for Polish nationalists. Paris became the home of many Polish intellectuals and revolutionaries, including Adam Mickiewicz, who, while in exile, continued to write and inspire others with his vision of a free Poland. Polish political groups in Paris, London, and other European cities worked to spread the message of Polish independence, often aligning themselves with broader European movements for national self-determination. Perhaps the most important aspect of the Polish exile community's activity was its ability to draw attention to the plight of the Polish people. Through their lobbying efforts, Polish exiles were able to gain support from key European powers, particularly France, which was sympathetic to the idea of a Polish restoration. These efforts paid off in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Poland's struggle for independence became an issue in European diplomacy. As the international political landscape shifted, Poland's cause gained increasing attention, especially as other European nations began to question the legitimacy of the partitioning powers. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, created a unique opportunity for Poland to regain its independence after more than a century of foreign domination. The war significantly altered the political landscape of Europe, and the collapse of the Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires created a vacuum in which nations and peoples previously under imperial rule sought self-determination. For Poland, the chaos of the war and the weakening of the partitioning powers, Russia, Germany, and Austria, offered a chance to realize the long-held dream of sovereignty. Polish nationalism, which had been kept alive by exile communities, intellectuals, and revolutionaries, began to gain new momentum during the war. Many Poles saw the war as an opportunity to form alliances with the major European powers, particularly the Allied powers, and to use the conflict as leverage for Polish independence. The Polish people's hopes were embodied in the efforts of figures such as Józef Pilsudski, a prominent military leader and politician who had long advocated for Polish sovereignty. Pilsudski, who had fought in the 1905 revolution in Russia and the 1914 to 1915 campaigns, believed that the collapse of the Russian Empire and the weakening of Germany provided the best chance for Polish independence. Pilsudski's vision of an independent Poland was focused on securing alliances with other European powers. He sought to organize Polish legions to fight alongside the Austro-Hungarian Empire against Russia, hoping to create a strong military and political position for Poland in post-war Europe. At the same time, the Polish National Committee, led by Roman Dmowski, was working with the Allied powers, particularly France, to convince them of the necessity of a free and independent Poland. The two leaders, Pilsudski and Dmowski, represented competing factions of the Polish independence movement. Pilsudski sought a more militaristic, independent approach, while Dmowski emphasized diplomacy and the support of the Western Allies. During the war, the Polish legions, under Pilsudski's leadership, fought in several key battles against the Russian forces on the Eastern Front. Although the legions were initially formed as part of the Austro-Hungarian army, Pilsudski's ultimate goal was to use the conflict to build a unified Polish military force that would later be instrumental in securing the country's sovereignty. Pilsudski and his supporters believed that the war would create the conditions for Polish independence, and that once the war ended, Poland would be able to negotiate with the victorious powers for its rightful place in the European order. The First World War ended in 1918 with the defeat of the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The collapse of these empires created significant political upheaval across Europe, and new national boundaries were drawn in the wake of the war. The Russian Empire, in particular, was devastated by the revolution of 1917, which led to the Bolshevik seizure of power and the eventual withdrawal of Russia from the war. This left the German and Austro-Hungarian empires in a weakened state, providing an opening for Poland to assert its independence. Following the end of the war, the victorious Allied powers gathered at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 to establish the post-war order. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, officially ended the war and set the stage for the reorganization of Europe. One of the key issues on the table was the future of Poland, which had been absent from the map of Europe for more than a century. The question of Polish independence became a central focus of the negotiations, as both the Allies and the Central Powers sought to establish a new European order. Józef Pilsudski and the Polish National Committee played critical roles in advocating for Poland's independence at the peace conference. Pilsudski's military successes and his strategic alliances with the Allies provided him with significant leverage in negotiations. He was able to gain the support of key figures such as French Premier Georges Clemenceau and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, both of whom recognized the importance of creating an independent Poland as part of the post-war settlement. The Treaty of Versailles established the borders of the newly reconstituted Polish state and recognized Poland's sovereignty. Poland was restored as an independent nation for the first time since the partitions of the late 18th century. The newly established Second Polish Republic included territories that had once been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but it also included areas that were contested by neighboring countries, including Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. These border disputes would lead to further conflict, but the Treaty of Versailles marked the formal recognition of Poland's independence in the international community. Although Poland had regained its independence, the country's borders remained uncertain and contested. The Treaty of Versailles, while recognizing Polish sovereignty, did not resolve all the territorial disputes, and several neighboring countries laid claim to Polish lands. The most significant of these was the Soviet Union, which had emerged as the successor to the Russian Empire following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The Soviet leadership, under Vladimir Lenin, sought to extend its influence westward, and Poland stood in its way. The Polish-Soviet War, 1919 to 1921, was a direct result of these territorial disputes. The war began in 1919 when Soviet forces, seeking to expand the Bolshevik Revolution to the west, invaded Poland. The Polish government, led by Józef Pilsudski, recognized the threat posed by the Soviet Union and mobilized its forces to defend the newly established republic. Pilsudski's strategy was to create a federation of states in Eastern Europe, including Ukraine and Belarus, to serve as a buffer against Soviet expansion. He believed that a strong Polish state could lead the fight against communism and prevent the spread of Bolshevism to other parts of Europe. The war between Poland and Soviet Russia was fierce, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. The decisive battle came in August 1920 at the Battle of Warsaw, often referred to as the Miracle on the Vistula. In this critical battle, the Polish forces, led by Pilsudski, managed to halt the Soviet advance and deliver a decisive blow to the Red Army. The victory at Warsaw not only preserved Polish independence, but also halted the spread of communism in Europe. The Treaty of Riga, signed in March 1921, officially ended the conflict and established the border between Poland and Soviet Russia, with Poland securing significant territories in the east. After the victory in the Polish-Soviet War and the signing of the Treaty of Riga in 1921, the Second Polish Republic was officially re-established, marking the end of more than 120 years of partition. However, the new Poland faced a number of challenges as it sought to consolidate its independence and establish itself as a modern European state. The interwar period from 1921 to 1939 was marked by political instability, economic difficulties, and tension between different national and ethnic groups within the newly defined borders. One of the most significant challenges faced by Poland during this period was its political system. The Polish Constitution of 1921, which was intended to establish a democratic republic, created a parliamentary system that struggled with inefficiency and fragmentation. The country was divided along political, regional, and social lines, and no single political faction was able to dominate the political landscape. This lack of unity led to frequent changes in government and political instability as various factions vied for control of the state. Additionally, Poland's interwar government faced challenges in dealing with its diverse population, which included not only ethnic Poles, but also significant minorities such as Jews, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Germans. The treatment of these minority groups became a source of internal strife, as they often felt marginalized or oppressed within the framework of a Polish-dominated state. Nationalist movements in the borderlands, such as the Ukrainian nationalists in the east, further complicated the political situation. These ethnic tensions were exacerbated by the fact that the newly drawn borders were contested by neighboring states, leading to territorial disputes and border skirmishes with Germany, Lithuania, and the Soviet Union. Poland also struggled with economic difficulties during the interwar years. The Great Depression in the 1930s had a profound impact on the country's economy, exacerbating the already existing issues of poverty, unemployment, and industrial decline. Despite efforts to modernize the economy and build infrastructure, the country remained economically fragile and heavily dependent on agricultural exports. This economic instability, combined with political turbulence, created a volatile environment that left Poland vulnerable to external threats in the years leading up to World War II. As the 1930s progressed, Europe was increasingly destabilized by the rise of totalitarian regimes, particularly Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. In Poland, the political landscape was also shifting, with authoritarianism becoming more prevalent. In 1926, Józef Pilsudski, the architect of Poland's independence and a popular national hero, staged a coup d'état known as the May Coup. After the coup, Pilsudski established a more authoritarian regime, which focused on stabilizing the country through strong leadership, while still maintaining a veneer of democracy. Pilsudski's regime, known as Sanacja, meaning sanitation or healing, was characterized by a centralization of power, the suppression of political opposition, and limited democratic freedoms. While Pilsudski's government sought to modernize Poland and strengthen its institutions, it also grew increasingly repressive over time. Poland's foreign policy in the 1930s was largely shaped by the growing threat of Nazi Germany. As Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Poland found itself facing a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. The aggressive expansionist policies of Nazi Germany, combined with the ever-present threat of Soviet communism, left Poland in a precarious position. Poland's foreign policy during this time was characterized by an attempt to maintain a delicate balance between Germany and the Soviet Union. On one hand, Poland sought to ensure its security by engaging in diplomatic talks with Germany, hoping to avoid conflict while also maintaining its independence. On the other hand, Poland remained wary of Soviet expansionism, which had already led to tensions along its eastern borders. In 1934, Poland signed the German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact, which was intended to secure peace between the two countries. The pact, however, did not provide Poland with the security it needed. The rise of Nazi Germany and its increasingly aggressive policies, particularly its demands for territorial expansion, made it clear that Poland's borders would be under threat in the near future. As Poland was caught between the rising threat of Nazi Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east, the country's strategic position grew increasingly untenable. Poland also made efforts to strengthen its alliances with other European countries, particularly France and Britain. However, Poland's foreign policy was hampered by the lack of strong diplomatic support from these powers. Both France and Britain, despite their alliances with Poland, were hesitant to directly confront Germany, and their diplomatic efforts to contain Hitler's aggression were ultimately ineffective. As a result, Poland found itself isolated and vulnerable, particularly after the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in August 1939, which divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The failure of Poland's foreign policy in the face of rising totalitarian threats culminated in the invasion of Poland in September 1939. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, launched a brutal invasion of Poland, triggering the start of World War II. The German attack, known as the Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, employed fast-moving tanks, infantry, and airstrikes to overwhelm the Polish defenses. The Polish military, despite its valiant resistance, was quickly outmatched by the modern and well-equipped German forces. The German invasion was a shock to Poland, which had hoped that its non-aggression pact with Germany would ensure peace, but it was ultimately a betrayal that sealed the fate of the Polish state. Just days later, on September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union, in accordance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded Poland from the east. The two invasions, the German from the west and the Soviet from the east, caught Poland in a vice, and the country was quickly overrun by the combined forces of the Nazis and the Soviets. The Polish government fled to Romania, and by October 6, 1939, Poland had been completely occupied. The German-Soviet invasion of Poland marked the beginning of a period of brutal occupation and repression. Poland's population suffered enormously during the war, with millions of Poles, including Jewish civilians, being killed or sent to concentration camps. The Polish resistance movement, however, remained active throughout the war, fighting against both the German and Soviet occupations. The struggle for Polish independence continued, even though the country was divided between two totalitarian regimes. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, marking the beginning of World War II, the country was quickly overwhelmed by the might of the German military. The tactic of blitzkrieg, lightning war, which involved swift and overwhelming attacks using combined forces of infantry, tanks, and air support, left Poland's defenses unable to withstand the assault. Within weeks, Germany had captured large portions of the country, and Polish forces were forced to retreat. The division of Poland was formalized by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which led to the Soviet invasion from the east on September 17, 1939. The dual invasions effectively split Poland in two. The western part of the country was occupied by Nazi Germany, while the eastern regions were annexed by the Soviet Union. Poland's once proud cities, including Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów, were subjected to brutal occupation and repression. Under Nazi rule, Poland became the site of some of the most horrific atrocities of World War II. The Nazis implemented a policy of systematic extermination, targeting Jews, Polish intelligentsia, and anyone considered an enemy of the Reich. Approximately 6 million Poles perished during the war, including 3 million Jews, as Poland became the central battleground for the Nazi genocide. The Holocaust, which took place in Poland, saw the construction of infamous concentration and extermination camps, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor, where millions of Jews and other minorities were murdered in gas chambers. The occupation also saw the destruction of Poland's cultural heritage. Nazi authorities sought to erase Polish culture and history by destroying monuments, confiscating books, and imprisoning Polish intellectuals. Poland's universities were closed, and many of the country's leaders were executed or exiled. The Polish population was forced into ghettos, particularly in cities like Warsaw, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were confined and subjected to horrific conditions. The ghettos became sites of unimaginable suffering, disease, starvation, and death. Poland's resistance movement, which had been underground since the early days of the invasion, began to organize itself into various groups. The Polish resistance, known as the Armia Krajowa, Home Army, became one of the largest and most effective resistance movements in Nazi-occupied Europe. Operating secretly, they carried out sabotage missions, gathered intelligence, and participated in uprisings, most notably the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. The Warsaw Uprising, launched on August 1st, 1944, was one of the most significant events in Poland's resistance to Nazi occupation. It was an attempt by the Polish Home Army to liberate Warsaw from German control before the Soviet forces, advancing from the east, could take the city. The uprising was also a symbolic gesture of Polish defiance against the Nazis and a desire to reassert Polish sovereignty in the face of both German and Soviet domination. The uprising began with the hopes of seizing key positions in Warsaw and establishing control of the city before the arrival of the Soviet Red Army. The Home Army, composed mainly of Polish soldiers, partisans, and volunteers, launched a coordinated attack against the German forces occupying the city. For several weeks, the Polish resistance put up fierce resistance, engaging in urban warfare against the heavily armed and well-equipped German forces. However, the uprising was doomed from the start due to a lack of external support. Despite earlier promises of aid from the Soviet Union, the Red Army halted its advance on the outskirts of Warsaw, leaving the Home Army to face the German military without assistance. The German forces, led by General Erich von Dambach-Zalewski, responded with extreme brutality, launching counterattacks and systematically destroying large portions of the city. The German strategy was to break the spirit of the Polish resistance and crush any hope for Polish independence. The Warsaw Uprising ultimately failed, and by October 2nd, 1944, after 2 months of fierce fighting, the Polish resistance was forced to surrender. Over 200,000 civilians were killed during the uprising, and the city of Warsaw was left in ruins. The Germans, in retaliation for the resistance, embarked on a policy of total destruction, demolishing large parts of the city and deporting its surviving inhabitants. The Polish population was either killed, sent to concentration camps, or forced to flee. The destruction of Warsaw was a catastrophic blow to Poland, both physically and psychologically. After the defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945, the political landscape of Europe changed dramatically, and Poland's fate was further sealed by the emerging Cold War. While the Red Army had played a key role in the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union's intentions for post-war Poland were far from benign. As the Allies, particularly the United States and Great Britain, struggled to negotiate with Joseph Stalin's regime, Poland fell within the Soviet sphere of influence. In the Yalta Conference of 1945, which was attended by Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union was granted control over Poland's eastern territories, and the country was effectively placed under Soviet occupation. Stalin's aim was to establish a pro-Soviet communist government in Poland, which would serve as a buffer state against potential Western threats. The Soviet-backed Polish Workers' Party, later the Polish United Workers' Party, took control of the government, while the Army of Krajowa and other resistance groups, who had fought valiantly against both the Germans and the Soviets, were marginalized or persecuted. The Polish Home Army was disbanded, and many of its leaders were arrested, executed, or forced into exile. The Soviet occupation also brought about significant changes in Poland's political, economic, and social structures. The communists quickly implemented land reforms, nationalized industry, and eliminated political opposition, using violence and repression to maintain control. Despite this, many Poles continued to resist Soviet rule, and the struggle for Polish independence did not end with the defeat of Nazi Germany. The Polish people, who had suffered through years of war and occupation, were now faced with the prospect of Soviet domination, which would last for several decades. Poland, once a proud and independent nation, was now a satellite state under Soviet control. The Warsaw Uprising and the Polish resistance had proven that the Polish people would continue to fight for their freedom, but the political and military realities of the post-war world made independence a distant dream. The next chapter of Polish history would be one of struggle, resistance, and hope as the country moved forward under the shadow of Soviet occupation. After World War II, Poland found itself deeply embedded in the Soviet sphere of influence, despite the country's brief independence after the collapse of Nazi Germany. The Potsdam Agreement, 1945, confirmed the new boundaries of Poland, with the Soviet Union annexing significant portions of its eastern territories. In exchange, Poland gained some German territories to the west, but these changes left the Polish people under the heavy shadow of Stalinist control. The post-war period was marked by the establishment of a Soviet-backed communist government that systematically eliminated opposition, including political parties, intellectuals, and military groups who had resisted Nazi occupation. The Soviet-imposed government in Poland began by nationalizing the economy, collectivizing agriculture, and imposing harsh ideological controls. The Polish United Workers' Party, PZPR, the Communist Party, consolidated its power with the support of Moscow, while dissent was brutally suppressed. The communist regime aimed to reshape Polish society along Marxist-Leninist lines, with the Soviet Union controlling nearly all aspects of Polish political, economic, and cultural life. However, the transition from Nazi occupation to Soviet rule was not without friction. The Polish people had already suffered decades of foreign domination, and many viewed the new Soviet-imposed order as merely another form of oppression. The mass implementation of Soviet-style governance led to significant economic hardship and social discontent. Poland's agricultural and industrial output suffered under centralized planning, and consumer goods became scarce. This economic stagnation worsened over time as Poland's relationship with Moscow became more dependent. The political repression that accompanied Soviet control exacerbated the dissatisfaction among the Polish people, who grew increasingly restless under the regime's heavy-handed tactics. Despite the pervasive fear of state violence, the people of Poland did not passively accept Soviet rule. A growing underground resistance movement began to emerge, and it laid the groundwork for larger, more significant movements that would eventually challenge Soviet authority in Poland. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, the Polish people's frustration with their rulers grew. The government's attempts to impose collectivization, the nationalization of private property, and the repression of the Catholic Church, which remained a powerful force in Polish society, alienated many citizens. Although the Stalinist purges were somewhat less severe in Poland than in other Eastern Bloc countries, the regime's attempts to control every aspect of life, including intellectual and cultural life, created a deep sense of oppression. In response, Polish workers and intellectuals began organizing protests and strikes in the 1950s and 1960s, expressing their dissatisfaction with the Soviet-backed government. In 1956, after Stalin's death and the subsequent thaw in Soviet politics, Polish workers in the city of Poznan went on strike, demanding better living conditions and greater political freedom. The protests were violently suppressed by the government, but they marked a turning point in Polish society as they exposed the growing tension between the Polish people and the communist authorities. This marked the beginning of a series of uprisings and protests that would culminate in the 1980s with the birth of Solidarity, a movement that would play a crucial role in Poland's eventual transition to democracy. By 1980, the discontent that had simmered for decades finally boiled over. The catalyst for this change came in the form of a labor strike at the Gdansk shipyard in northern Poland. This strike, which began in August of that year, was led by Lech Walesa, a shipyard worker who would go on to become one of Poland's most prominent leaders in the fight for independence. The strike was sparked by the dismissal of Anna Walentynowicz, a shipyard worker and union activist, which led to a walkout by workers who were protesting her unjust firing. What began as a local protest quickly expanded as workers from other factories in Gdansk and beyond joined in solidarity. Walesa, a charismatic and determined leader, quickly emerged as the symbol of the protest movement. The strikers' demands were centered around the right to form independent trade unions, better working conditions, and greater political freedoms. The Polish government, which was heavily influenced by the Soviet Union, initially tried to suppress the strike through force, but the workers' resolve proved stronger than anticipated. After several weeks of negotiations and widespread support from the Polish population, the government was forced to make significant concessions. On August 31st, 1980, the Polish government, led by General Wojciech Jaruzelski, agreed to the Gdansk Agreement, which granted workers the right to form independent trade unions, marking a major victory for the workers. The agreement also allowed for the establishment of the Solidarity movement, a free trade union that would eventually grow into a political force that opposed the communist regime. The movement, which quickly gained millions of members, became the largest social movement in Polish history and a direct challenge to Soviet-backed governance in Eastern Europe. Solidarity's emergence marked a turning point in Poland's struggle for freedom. It not only represented a challenge to the authoritarian regime in Poland, but also signaled the beginning of the broader collapse of communist rule in Eastern Europe. Solidarity's success inspired similar movements in other Eastern Bloc countries, including Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and helped pave the way for the eventual fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Lech Walesa, who had become the leader of Solidarity, gained international recognition for his role in advocating for human rights and political freedom in Poland. However, the road to success was not without setbacks. In December 1981, the Polish government, fearing that Solidarity posed an existential threat to the communist state, declared martial law, arresting thousands of Solidarity leaders, including Walesa, and cracking down on political opposition. Despite these harsh measures, Solidarity continued to operate underground and maintained its popular support. By the mid-1980s, the economic situation in Poland had worsened, and public discontent reached a boiling point once again. The pressure from the people, coupled with the weakening of the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika reforms, created a situation in which the Polish government had little choice but to engage in talks with the opposition. By the late 1980s, Poland had become a focal point in the fight for political reform in Eastern Europe. The economic hardships, combined with the growing influence of Solidarity, forced the government to acknowledge the need for change. In 1988, a wave of strikes swept across the country, and the government was finally forced to recognize that it could no longer ignore the demands of the people. The Polish leadership, under pressure from both domestic unrest and the broader context of the Soviet Union's weakening grip on Eastern Europe, agreed to enter negotiations with Solidarity and other opposition groups. In February 1989, the government and Solidarity entered into the Round Table Talks, a historic series of negotiations that aimed to resolve Poland's political crisis. The talks were seen as a turning point in Poland's history, as they provided a platform for both the communist government and the opposition to discuss the future of the country. The Round Table Talks resulted in several important agreements, including the legalization of Solidarity as a political party, the creation of a bicameral parliament, and the establishment of partially free elections. These agreements paved the way for the first semi-free elections in Poland since the Second World War. On June 4th, 1989, Poland held its first partially free elections in decades. Solidarity won a stunning victory, capturing 99 of the 100 Senate seats and securing a significant majority in the lower house of parliament. This overwhelming victory marked the beginning of the end of communist rule in Poland. Lech Walesa, who had been released from prison during the negotiations, became a key figure in the transition to a democratic Poland. The success of the Round Table Talks and the subsequent elections marked a turning point in Poland's history. It was not only the beginning of the end of communism in Poland, but also a key moment in a larger wave of democratic transitions that swept through Eastern Europe, leading to the eventual fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The historic elections of June 1989 marked a significant turning point in Polish history, signaling the collapse of communism in the country and the beginning of its transition to democracy. Solidarity's overwhelming victory in these elections meant that the Polish people had chosen a new path, one toward a more open and democratic society. The transition was not immediate, but the political shift was clear. Poland would no longer be ruled by Soviet-backed communist authorities. In the months following the elections, negotiations between Solidarity leaders, the communist government, and the Polish People's Party led to the formation of a new coalition government. Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a leading figure in Solidarity, was appointed as Poland's first non-communist prime minister since World War II. This was a groundbreaking achievement that signified the end of decades of communist rule. Mazowiecki's government was tasked with overseeing the transition to democracy and initiating much-needed economic reforms. Poland's new government was faced with immense challenges. The country had to recover from years of economic mismanagement under communist rule, a process that required sweeping reforms and difficult choices. Poland's economic structure was heavily centralized and state-controlled, which had led to inefficiencies and stagnation. As part of its commitment to reform, the government implemented a set of drastic economic measures known as the Balcerowicz Plan, named after Leszek Balcerowicz, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. The plan aimed to stabilize the Polish economy by introducing market reforms, reducing inflation, privatizing state-owned enterprises, and cutting government spending. Though the plan had long-term benefits, it was highly controversial in the short term, leading to economic hardship and growing discontent among the population. At the same time, Poland's political transformation began in earnest. The country's first freely elected parliament was formed in 1990, and the first direct presidential elections took place. Lech Walesa, the leader of Solidarity and the face of the anti-communist movement, won the presidency with a clear mandate for reform. His presidency symbolized the triumph of Poland's struggle for freedom. Walesa's rise to power was a direct result of the work done by the Solidarity movement over the preceding decade, and his leadership would play a crucial role in consolidating the country's democratic gains. However, his presidency was not without challenges, as political divisions and economic difficulties continued to threaten the stability of Poland's newfound democracy. After the collapse of communism, Poland began its reintegration into Europe. For decades, Poland had been isolated behind the Iron Curtain, excluded from the political and economic structures that shaped post-war Europe. Now, with the end of Soviet domination, Poland was determined to join the European mainstream. The first step in this process was Poland's pursuit of membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the European Union, EU. Poland's quest for NATO membership was driven by both security concerns and the desire to solidify its independence from Russia. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left Russia in a weakened state, but Poland still faced the risk of Russian interference in its internal affairs. NATO membership was seen as a crucial step in ensuring Poland's security and stability. In 1999, Poland's efforts were rewarded when the country officially became a member of NATO. This was a historic moment for Poland, as it marked the end of its status as a satellite state of the Soviet Union and the beginning of its integration into Western security structures. Simultaneously, Poland pursued membership in the European Union. As the Soviet Union disintegrated and former Eastern Bloc countries sought a path to Western-style democracy and market economies, Poland worked to meet the criteria set by the EU for membership. Poland's path to EU membership was not easy, as it required significant political, economic, and legal reforms. Poland had to overhaul its institutions, strengthen the rule of law, and create a market-oriented economy. The country's commitment to these reforms was evident in the late 1990s and early 2000s as Poland embraced a pro-Western orientation and deepened its ties with European countries. While Poland and Germany have largely moved beyond historical grievances, the memory of the war and the aftermath of German occupation remain sensitive issues. Poland has occasionally raised concerns about the lack of full reparations for the destruction caused by the Nazis, as well as the treatment of Polish citizens during the war. Despite these issues, Poland and Germany maintain strong economic and diplomatic relations, and both countries work closely within the EU and NATO frameworks. Poland's relationship with Ukraine is another crucial aspect of its foreign policy. Poland has been one of the most outspoken supporters of Ukraine's sovereignty, particularly in the wake of Russia's annexation of Crimea and its ongoing involvement in the Donbass conflict. Poland has provided political, military, and economic support to Ukraine, including humanitarian aid and military training. The two countries share a long history, marked by both cooperation and conflict, But in recent years, Poland has positioned itself as a staunch ally of Ukraine in its struggle to resist Russian aggression. Poland's support for Ukraine is also rooted in the desire to see Ukraine integrate more closely with European institutions, including NATO and the EU. Poland's leadership role in supporting Ukraine has further strengthened its position as a key player in the broader European security architecture. Poland's rapid economic transformation since the collapse of communism has positioned it as one of Europe's most dynamic economies. The country's GDP growth has been consistently strong, and Poland has emerged as one of the leading economies in Central and Eastern Europe. The country's integration into the European Union in 2004 has played a key role in this success, providing access to the single European market, EU development funds, and political stability.